Dr. Brzezinski, as is well known, served as National Security Advisor throughout the administration of President Carter from 1977 to 1981. He is currently Professor of American Foreign Policy at the Johns Hopkins University NITSE School of Advanced International Studies and serves also as counselor to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's the author of many books and articles, most recently and prominently a book entitled The Grand Failure, The Birth and Death of Communism in the 20th Century. Dr. Brzezinski will speak for something up to 20 minutes and then will field his own questions. Please stand, identify yourself, and speak loudly and clearly since we don't have a public address system in the room. Dr. Brzezinski.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, let me begin by saying, and in saying it, I'm being quite sincere, that I speak with some sense of diffidence on this complex but also important subject. I know that there is any number of people in this room who know much more about this issue than I do, and who could speak about it much more authoritatively. Nonetheless, I suppose I have been asked to address this issue in part because I have had some direct involvement in American policy towards that important part of the world, and also because I have an unfortunate tendency to stick my neck out on controversial issues. In fact, I rather suspect it was probably the second consideration, more than the first, that led to this invitation. More specifically, I have been asked to discuss American policy towards this region. And in order to do that, I believe that one has to begin by at least an attempted appraisal of the regional consequences of the recently conducted war. What are its effects? What kind of a ledger can one draw on the basis of which one can then, hopefully, reach some intelligent conclusions regarding the desirable as well as future course of American policy? The war, of course, was controversial, and perhaps some of you know that I was involved in the debate prior to it. I simply state that as a reminder that my views on the subject, therefore, may be somewhat subjective, and that consideration has to be taken into account. Nonetheless, I would like to attempt an appraisal which hopefully can be reasonably objective and detached. I certainly would be the first to concede, and in fact to stress, that the war established an important principle of regional relevance, namely that unilateral aggression cannot be sustained. And this principle has certainly been reaffirmed. As a consequence of that, as a general proposition, one has to assume that the level of regional security has been heightened. That is to say, a major power in the region capable of imposing its will through unilateral military action has in fact been defanged, and has been defanged rather painfully without too much anesthetic. And this is an important lesson which does have implications for the future. I think it is also presumably fair to conclude that in that context, those Arab states which over the years have been inclined to associate their fortunes more with the United States than with the principal competitor of the United States have likewise been reassured that their sense of confidence, particularly in America itself, has been heightened, their sense of vulnerability to external military pressure reduced. and that, of course, is of regional significance and potentially contributes to enhance stability of the region as a whole. This is related, in turn, to the role that the United States plays in this region. And there's no doubt that as a consequence of the war, America now enjoys an undisputed strategic presence in the Persian Gulf region, in the Middle East as a whole. The rivalry for influence, which has dominated the politics of this region for so many decades, in recent years between the United States and the Soviet Union, but in earlier times, to some extent, between the United States and Great Britain, and earlier still between Britain and France, has to some extent come to an end in a geostrategic sense, and has come to an end in a setting in which American credibility is high both militarily and politically. And it is important to note that because this particularly has significant implications for American policy in the region if America chooses to have a policy for the region. Beyond that, of course, there is the fact, simple but basic fact which needs to be registered, that access to oil has been reaffirmed, that the vital interests of the West were reasserted. And last but not least, as a positive development in the region, one has to note the increased salience of Turkey as a country that, while not oriented towards active participation in the Middle East, and while viewing itself increasingly as a putative member of the European community, nonetheless is prepared to play an important stabilizing role. And that, too, is a factor that contributes to enhanced regional stability. There may be other considerations of a positive nature that flow from the war, but by and large, in my assessment, I would put primary emphasis on the foregoing. But clearly, any assessment also has to ask whether there are any downsides resulting from the war before a conclusive judgment is reached. And it seems to me that several have to be taken into consideration. First of all, the regional balance of power has been disrupted and to all intents and purposes no longer exists. In a regional sense, potentially the most important military power is now Iran, and none of the Arab states in the Gulf are capable of standing up to it on their own, especially with the destruction of Iraq. This, in the longer run, has potentially some negative implications for the stability of the region, given some lingering hostility between the Iranian government and the governments on the other side of the Gulf, not to speak of the very overt hostility of Iran towards the United States. A hostility that still continues, though its intensity in recent times has been moderated and hopefully will continue to decline. Beyond that, as a factor of potential insecurity in the area, is the continued complication arising from the fact that while the war against Iraq was militarily decisive, it was politically inconclusive. And there is a sharp contradiction between these two propositions. The war was one-sided in its military outcome. It was somewhat blurred in its political outcome. And I refer, of course, to the fact that Saddam Hussein is still in power. Given the hostility between him and his Arab neighbors, not to speak of the obvious hostility between him and the United States, this is not a stabilizing factor, but it is now a fact of reality. And that, I think, complicates the picture considerably. The United States has adopted the position that it will maintain sanctions against Iraq as a whole as long as Mr. Saddam Hussein is in power. There is a problem with that posture. It was, after all, the argument of the administration that sanctions would not work in forcing Iraq out of Kuwait. I find it somewhat difficult to understand why, if sanctions would not work to force Iraq out of Kuwait, they'll somehow compel Saddam Hussein to commit political suicide. I find that somewhat uncredible. Indeed, I think a credible argument can be made that sanctions may have the effect of actually solidifying domestic support for him in the name of nationalism, in the sense of joint beleaguerment, in the kind of response that usually develops to prolonged external international pressure. In any case, the problem of sanctions is made even further complicated beyond its political ramifications by its moral connotations. For one of the negative aspects of the war, in my judgment, is the excessive pulverization of Iraqi society as a whole. To be sure, one cannot assign moral blame for that on American war planners, because they presumably operated on the prudent assumption that the opponent was very, very strong, and that hence maximum effort would have to be made to minimize Allied casualties. Nonetheless, the way the air war was conducted has produced a result which has been devastating for Iraqi society and which does raise some moral problems, if not pertaining to the war, then at least pertaining to its aftermath. I have in mind the conclusions drawn from two reports with which the audience being composed of experts on the Middle East, I assume everyone here is well familiar, namely the UN report and the Harvard Medical Report. Both reach very disturbing conclusions about the consequences of the assault on Iraqi society as a whole. The UN report speaks of apocalyptic consequences for Iraqi society, of Iraq being bombed back to the pre-industrial age. The Harvard Medical Report has very disturbing numbers of continuing moral relevance. They suggest that this year, 55,000 children have died or will die because of the direct consequences of the war. The impact of the war on the dramatically deteriorated hygienic conditions, food supplies, medical care, epidemics, and so forth. And to make matters worse, it estimates that an additional 170,000 may die in the course of the year if sanctions are continued, which prevent the access of Iraqi society to medicines, to food supplies, to the restoration of the essential minimal facilities for healthy human survival. This, I submit, is of moral concern, and I don't think we in America should be oblivious to that, because if we are, then we run the risk of a political conclusion being drawn, namely that we think that Arab lives are worthless. And that will have political effects if one is merely concerned about that dimension and ignores the moral. Beyond that, there is the continuing problem of the potential for fragmentation in Iraq, dramatically demonstrated by the extraordinary suffering of the Kurds, of the continuing suffering of the Shiites, all of which enhances the scope of internal socio-political instability and certainly does not contribute to greater security in the region. Continuing still on the negative side of the ledger, there are the continuing problems with the Kuwaiti government, a liberated nation with slogans during the war, deliberately invoking imagery of World War II and the liberation of Europe, parallels which seem increasingly strained when one looks at the performance and conduct of the current Kuwaiti government regarding its own public, regarding various accused of collaboration with Kuwait. All of that in turn might contribute, though I leave that to the judgment of people much more expert than myself, to some further intensification of Arab fundamentalism. I do not know the degree to which recent developments in North Africa can be seen as having been, at least in some measure, affected by a rise of anti-Westernism or anti-Americanism, but I suspect to some extent this might be the case. And it could become the case also in those Arab states in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, which we define currently as moderate, which are conservative, which are pro-American, but which may begin to be viewed increasingly as essentially overly dependent on American support and susceptible to American values. And finally, on the negative side of the ledger, there is the question whether the prospects for peace on the Arab-Israeli front have been enhanced or set back by the war. There was the expectation at one time that the new coalition, implicitly partaking of a collaborative relationship with Israel in the repulsion of Iraqi aggression, would create the objective and subjective preconditions for movement towards peace once hostilities are over. I wonder whether that still is the case. One can make a plausible argument that the Israeli posture will now be actually more rigid rather than more flexible, since potentially the most threatening Arab state has been removed from the scene, and thus, at least for a significant portion of Israeli body politic, and apparently for its current government, the opportunity arises to have its cake and eat it too, namely, to retain everything, because there is no overriding need from a strategic sense to reach a peaceful accommodation. Now, what does all of this add up to? In my judgment, at least, it adds up to, first of all, to a somewhat mixed picture, more mixed than the rather triumphalist analyses of recent weeks would suggest. But secondly, and far more importantly than that, I think a great deal depends on how the United States conducts itself politically in the aftermath of the war. How we behave now, I think, is likely to determine how ultimately history will evaluate the somewhat more mixed picture that I have presented, whether it is ultimately a positive or a negative outcome. It depends on the United States, because the United States is now deeply involved in the region. The United States is the preponderant strategic power in the region. The region is volatile, and specifically the Arab-Israeli relationship is stalemated. And that leads me to the basic view that the only way to make certain that the military success of the war becomes an enduring political success is for the United States to pursue a comprehensive approach, one which indeed engages the United States in a sustained effort regarding two centrally important issues: the security of the Persian Gulf, the creation of a structure of security and cooperation within it, and movement on the Arab-Israeli peace process as well. For there is a subtle, if not necessarily a causal, relationship between these two issues. And I do not believe that one can resolve one completely without progress in the other. The question of Persian Gulf security raises complex issues of arms control, security cooperation, which pertain not only specifically to the conditions in the Gulf and the potential threat either from Iran or Iraq, but it has bearing on the structure of security in the region as a whole. And clearly the flow of arms, the competition in weaponry is related, at least in part, to the Arab-Israeli process. And it would be very difficult to resolve the Arab-Israeli dispute in the context of continuing insecurity in the Gulf, the flow of weapons to the Gulf, continued rivalry in the acquisition of arms in the Gulf. These two issues are thus related. And insofar as the Gulf is concerned, I think it will behoove the United States to try to promote some new framework of security among the countries concerned, as well as ourselves, which commits us on a continuing basis to the security of that region, presumably also through some continued military presence. Perhaps it can be minimized for obviously desirable political reasons, but I do not believe it can be entirely avoided. And in fact, I think conditions increasingly indicate that American military presence in the region will be prolonged, even if not at the massive levels that we have recently seen. Arms control processes will have to be launched, but these will be inherently complex and very difficult because there is an interrelationship not only between the security problems of the Gulf and the Arab-Israeli dispute, but between security in the region and related regions. For example, it is difficult to speak of arms control and limitations on weaponry of mass destruction without in some fashion taking into account the question of Pakistani acquisition of more sophisticated weaponry. And once that issue is raised, inevitably that leads to a consideration of the Pakistani-Indian relationship. And the moment that is raised, obviously the question of the Indian-Chinese relationship arises. And hence we're dealing here with a seamless web, the resolution of which will require massive international undertakings and the participation of countries, even so to speak, remote from the region. In dealing with the Gulf also, it will be necessary to undertake ventures designed to promote economic cooperation in the region and some equalization of wealth in the region. And here too, I think there is a connection between that and the Arab-Israeli dispute, especially since some of the poorer Arab countries are more directly involved in that dispute and would be the beneficiaries of any attempted redistribution. And inherent in this, of course, is the sensitive, delicate issue of democratization, an issue which maybe cannot be posed directly in terms of that critical word, but which certainly has to be raised in terms of political participation. I think even the conservative regimes are more likely now to recognize that in the long run, enhanced political participation in the decision-making processes is inevitable. Fearing democracy, perhaps political participation as a principle might be the wedge which can be used in order to advance the process. But all of that requires some movement also on the Arab-Israeli peace process. And here, ultimately, the critical question is the Palestinian question, for it does involve the resolution of a painful political and human problem, namely what happens to the Palestinian nation, what kind of political rights should it have, how can they be institutionalized, how can they evolve over time, and in a manner which doesn't threaten the legitimate interest of Israel to a secure life in secure boundaries, recognized by all of the countries in the region, and maintaining a stable and peaceful relationship with them. This is an inherently complicated issue, to put it very mildly, and it's going to take an enormous effort to resolve it. The stumbling block in the first phase is going to be Palestinian participation. And here I happen to believe that the United States ought to take a clear-cut position that the Palestinian people have a right to be represented in these negotiations by negotiators not appointed for them by Israel, but chosen by themselves. This is a fundamental principle. We, the United States, were prepared to negotiate with the Viet Cong, and we compelled the South Vietnamese government to negotiate with the Viet Cong. The French negotiated with the FLN regarding the future of Algeria. The Sandinistas and the Contras negotiated with each other. At some point, Israel will have to negotiate with the political representative of the Palestinian nation. And if it is not prepared for its own internal political reasons to countenance the possibility of someday engaging in direct negotiations with PLO, because it has become such a paralyzing issue in Israeli domestic politics, then at the very least, Israel has to be prepared to negotiate with negotiators freely chosen by the Palestinians in free and open electoral process in which the Palestinian people are permitted to participate. And that is, I think, the only way out of this dilemma, because otherwise the Palestinians will not take part in a process of negotiating their future with negotiators representing their ultimate aspirations and views. And there is a moderate Palestinian leadership on the ground in West Bank, which presumably would emerge through such a process. I do not propose to outline here, because it would be presumptuous and pointless, the nature of possible settlement or the possible outcome of movement on the security issue of the region, but I would like to conclude with a more basic political observation. In order to move the process forward, not only is American engagement necessary, given the fact that we are now so centrally involved and are the determining power in the region without any rivals, but it is also necessary for this process, if it is to be effective, to be provided with the needed leadership. My experience in government, as well as my observation of the history of American relationship with this region, teaches me one very simple proposition. There would be no movement, no progress on this issue, unless American leadership is engaged at the highest level. This is not an issue which can be pushed forward by negotiators, special emissaries, however skilled. It is not an issue that can be resolved even by an energetic, able, and influential Secretary of State. It is an issue which is, first of all, intensely domestic, political in nature in America. And it is an issue which is bound to galvanize, while the process is moving forward, deep emotions, great many pressures, some political conflicts. And therefore it requires a commitment by a leader who's prepared to bite the bullet, who is prepared to go through that stage, because subsequently there are political rewards to be reaped once a breakthrough occurs. But the process itself is painful, difficult, and costly. And it will require an enormous amount of stamina and commitment. But in my judgment, there will be no movement, and indeed there will be no American policy in the region unless the President is prepared to be as upfront on this issue of seeking peace and security, as he was upfront on the issue of war. Once he makes that choice, I think we will have a breakthrough. And if he doesn't, we'll have a stalemate. Thank you. We have a little time for an exchange of views, questions. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. 20 years ago at Columbia, we had a discussion on the same issue, and I know your ideas were, in principle, very similar to this. And when you came to the White House, I'm not trying to embarrass you, you were gracious and kind. Why didn't you push, or at least try to implement some of the basic ideas I know very well that you were committed to, at least in academic way?
Well, perhaps you have heard of Camp David. The problem, however, is that it is not only a matter of America pushing. It is also a matter of conditions being created whereby the American push is facilitated both regionally and within America. And one of the problems I have discovered also over the years, that one has to deal not only with the difficulty of negotiating with the Israelis, who can be quite intransigent, but one has a difficulty of negotiating with the Arabs, whose posture tends to be to reject compromise solutions, only to accept them roughly 10 years later, but to insist instead that America negotiate for them totally, completely, and on behalf of their maximum objectives. And that America will not do. And therefore, in order to move the peace process forward, I think a far greater degree of sophistication and flexibility has to be demonstrated by the Arabs. In fact, if I were to draw up a scenario designed to outline as self-destructive a foreign policy that the Arabs could devise for themselves vis-à-vis Israel, I'll probably do 90% of the things the Arabs have done over the years. They have made it easy for the problem not to be resolved. And therefore, a further consideration in all of this is that if an American president is to be engaged, and if he's going to put a lot on the line, there has to be an enormous amount of flexibility on the Arab side to make that possible. In different ways, Saddam did that. And he did obtain something for Egypt at least. Yes, sir. Can I just get some water?
You said that Iran is now the dominant. Stand up, please. You said that Iran is now clearly the dominant military power in the Gulf, and that other Arab states can't stand alone against this. At the same time, you're talking about regional security arrangements that guarantee the stability of the region. What role do you think Iran should be given, or what role should Iran have in the security and general arrangements in the region?
Well, first of all, I do reiterate the point I made. I think that hopefully over time, there will be some amelioration in the American-Iranian relationship. I think in the long run, this is in the interest of both sides. Moreover, from our point of view, notwithstanding what may or may not happen in the Soviet Union in years to come, Iran is the critical geopolitical barrier between the Soviet Union as it is currently constituted and the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. And that means that from our point of view, the geopolitical integrity of Iran remains of importance. And that also contributes to an underlying complementarity of interest in at least one important respect. I would hope that over time, as it becomes clear that the Persian Gulf regimes are not susceptible to external pressure or to internal subversion initiated or supported by the Iranians through the fundamentalist movement, and that the United States is serious about its commitments, which I believe we have now demonstrated conclusively, that the Iranians themselves will come to realize that their future development, their role in the region is more likely to be enhanced by some gradual collaboration and then inclusion in some security arrangement than by a policy of confrontation or at least hostility. Not ignore them, I think within limits try to seek to improve the political and economic relationship, probably in the first instance through friends rather than directly, but not excluding the possibility of a gradual improvement in the American-Iranian economic connection. The embargoes and things of this sort are areas where flexibility can be demonstrated over time, especially if the Iranians were to exert themselves to resolve the hostage issue. Don't forget the hostage issue is still alive. These are the forgotten people, the victims of the conflict, and the Iranians do have some role in that problem, not only negatively, but hopefully also positively. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. One of the comments you made earlier is why. So when you mentioned the recent events about Africa, so this may be a result of the growing anti-Americans in the region, it seemed to imply that Islamic fundamental states are reacting against America or something like this. When you look at the region, for example, the Ennahda movement, it's in no way a radical movement.
Yeah, I didn't say that. Yeah, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. I was very explicit and very careful in saying that perhaps there may have been a contributing element, a sense of anti-Americanism in him. But I said I didn't know, I wasn't sure, but the most a contributing element. It certainly wasn't caused by America, and its central impetus doesn't originate from America. Anybody else? Yes, over there.
I'm very surprised. Thank you, Robert. I'm very surprised that one of your negatives did not include the substantially increased militarization supported or pushed by the administration since the end of the war. Secondly, the related proposal to eliminate non-conventional weapons from the region, excluding Israel. And thirdly, I might like to ask, what has happened to the determination to implement United Nations resolutions, the type of determination that implemented United Nations resolutions against Kuwait? Can't the same type of determination be implemented to remove Israel from the occupied territories under the resolutions?
Well, as far as the first point is concerned, I was talking about the consequences of the war. The problem of arms sales to the region antedates the war, as well as postdates the war. It's not a consequence of the war. I think it's one of the unfortunate aspects of the situation in the region, in which the parties compete. I do not applaud this, but I do not ascribe that development to the war. We have been major suppliers of arms to the Saudis, to the Israelis, and others before the war. And apparently, even though we are committed to arms control in the region, we have the intention of remaining such after the war as well. As far as the comparison between the resolution concerning Kuwait and 242 and 338 and Israel, and therefore some similarity of response is concerned, that's all and well on the level of logic or of political science fiction, but on the level of practicality, it's simply not in the cards. We're not going to organize an international coalition to expel Israel from the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan. We're just not going to do it. It's not in the cards. Anyone even remotely familiar with the American political process knows that this wouldn't survive a day and isn't consistent with American policy, etc., etc., etc. Also, the issues are really morally and historically far more ambiguous. In the case of the aggression against Kuwait, it was an outright, clear-cut, sudden invasion, annexation, and so forth. The history of the Arab-Israeli conflict is much more complicated than that. It involves, unfortunately, overlapping rights, overlapping sufferings. It is related to the experience of the century and a sense of the international community's responsibility, at least in part, for a measure of indifference to an act of genocide without precedent in human history. All of that certainly complicates that problem, and I think suggests that the analogy between, let's say, the West Bank and Israeli occupation of it and the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait is somewhat overdrawn. Right?
You mentioned the need for presidential leadership, and in answer to a question, you also referred to Camp David. Do you think the time has come to put two and two together and for the president to invite the chief leaders to a conference?
I was even thinking of saying something along these lines in my talk, but I decided I was sticking my neck out enough. But since you provoked me, and you were a key participant in that process, I think yes. I think if the effort to organize something through accommodation, through repeated missions of the Secretary of State, doesn't yield constructive results, I think the president should take the bit in his teeth and convene a conference. But in order to do that, he has to be sure in advance that at least some participants that are critical will come. Because you couldn't have a worse outcome than if he proposed a conference and then Shamir kicks him in the teeth and Assad kicks him in the teeth. Because then he would really look very bad. But if he has reason to believe that at least he will be assured of a positive response from one or another side, then the fact of such initiative and in such a context would put enormous pressure on the recalcitrant party, on the intransigent party. And I think would therefore have some probability of success given the very special standing the United States has. Moreover, a rejection of the presidential invitation in that context, I think, would play very badly in American public opinion. And if one looks at American public opinion polls, there is an inclination, very marked inclination, for the public to feel that we have spent too much money in the Middle East, we're giving too much money to the parties concerned, Israel included, that there should be a drawdown, and that there should be more assertive pursuit of peace. This emerges with particular clarity from the poll taken by the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations on American public and leadership attitudes in foreign policy. In fact, I think I may have it here, and let me just read to you a few items from it, because I think it is quite suggestive of a mood which the president, if he's determined, could exploit to his advantage. Here we are. Uh, 45% of the American public is in favor of decreasing economic aid to Israel, for example. Only 38% is in favor of keeping it, as is. American leadership community favors reduction of the economic aid by 54%, and only 4% favor an increase. Currently, the demand is for an increase. So that by and large, there is now a shift in public opinion, which a president determined to seek a fair, equitable peace, one which gives Israel that to which it is absolutely entitled: security, recognition, full and unlimited participation in any regional economic development program, but which also gives the Palestinians their political rights, I think the American people would support. And the president, with the kind of standing he has today, not only domestically but in the region, I think is probably in a better position to do what Carter did, and Carter pulled it off at least halfway, and is in a position comparable to that of Eisenhower in 1956. Last question, then I have to stop. Yes, ma'am.
What do you see as the role, if any, of King Hussein of Jordan in this?
Well, I think clearly, at some point, a resolution of the Palestinian problem will have to engage Jordan. And one would think that, given the enormous sensitivity on the question of independent statehood for the Palestinians, one might envisage a series of transitional arrangements which would have the effect of pacifying the anxieties of both sides and accommodating all to a relationship of peace and collaboration, and therefore could involve stages such as autonomy first, then some special status in relationship to Jordan, and then eventually after that perhaps some alternative status if that were the will of the Palestinian people. And in the implementation of any such scheme, clearly King Hussein and Jordan would be very important. Thank you very much.
Go behind the scenes of the events and issues you follow on C-SPAN with the C-SPAN